I'm going to be presenting on an introduction to systemic theology. And what systemic theology is it's a new branch or a new field of theology that's really needed to meet the needs today in the world. So some of the needs for systemic theology is that the world's becoming increasingly complex and interdependent. What scientists have done to respond to this is they've developed a lot of new fields. Systems theory is one of the overarching fields for that. And I believe that it's important that there's also a theological response, and that's what systemic theology is about, is how do you have a theology for dealing with a very complex world. And the problem with systems theory is that it only recognizes what can be quantified. And there's also a challenge with traditional theology, is that often it doesn't reflect the reality and needs of the world today. And getting into, what I mean by traditional theology is, if you look in this diagram, really traditional theology is that there is this vast gap between the supernatural and the natural. And one of the principles of it is that God only works in the supernatural. And the only evidence that there is God is by breaking natural laws. Part of that also is an agreement between science and theology to operate in different domains. And what this diagram shows is it shows that basically science and academics, they get all the different fields of knowledge out there, and theology is just left to the one field of the supernatural, which is kind of very limited in worldview. And the challenge of that is that it puts the focus on natural laws because they govern everything except when God decides to break them. It also puts the focus on materialism because the natural is, what can be measured and seen. It puts a big focus on that. Puts a big focus on the exterior versus the interior in terms of what people, can observe versus their own experience. It puts a focus on asking the question, what is true? And it takes the focus away from a lot of different things. It takes the focus away from the spiritual, beauty, culture, and asking the question of what is good or what is helpful. It also takes a focus away from the internal experience and from the collective perspective. And one of the biggest issues is it causes us to only look for God in the supernatural. And this divide between the supernatural and natural, that's not something that was around during New Testament times. They had a Hebraic view of the world, and that was very different from the Greek and Roman and our current kind of Western cultural that separates out the supernatural and natural. So biblically, this separation is something that really wasn't there. It's just something that we've kind of inherited from our Western culture. So the question is, what's the alternative? And that's what we're defining as systemic theology. And there's several principles of systemic theology. And first, let me say that systemic theology should not be confused with systematic theology. Systematic theology is something that is used to describe a complete analytical approach to theology that's taught in most theology schools. So there's a big difference between systematic theology, which is typically a class taught in seminaries, and systemic theology. And what systemic theology is it provides a systems perspective of understanding God and the world. And another principle is that God works at all levels of systems. He can define natural laws since he created them, but he can also influence events at every level of systems without defying natural laws. Another big shift in systemic theology is that it covers all knowledge, so all truth is God's truth. So rather than saying that, the theological domain is this tiny domain and everything else is left to academics, it says that all truth is God's truth. It avoids a false separation between the spiritual and the natural, And it leads us to look for God throughout our lives in the natural and in the supernatural. And it also helps us to focus on the systemic causes of things to understand their spiritual depth. So to explain the overall grid and the overall structure for systemic theology, I've developed a diagram that's actually borrowing from some of the ideas from Ken Wilber. The basic structure came from that, but it's not anything that's rocket science. It's just saying that you could divide the world into two different axes, and you can divide the systems of the world into two different axes. So one is the interior and exterior axes. So the exterior is the physical and what can be seen and measured, whereas the interior is not seen, but it can be experienced. So, what does the color blue look like to you, or what does pizza taste like? That would be the interior experience. And then the other axes, and in this diagram, the interior is on the top. I'm sorry. So the interior is the left side, and the exterior is the right side. And then there's another axis, which is the individual, which is focused on individual people and taking the individualistic perspective. And then there's the collective axis, which is focused on how people and things operate collectively. And the individual is the top half, and the collective is the bottom half. So that creates four quadrants, which have more common names. The exterior individual is the physical body, and that's the it perspective. And the interior individual is the mind, or what you might experience internally as an individual, and that is the I perspective. The interior collective is culture, or the collective internal experience of groups, and that's the we perspective. And the exterior collective quadrant is society, and that's the collective external experience of groups. And you might call that the they perspective. So, like any model, one thing that should be emphasized is that this is a rough approximation, but it's a helpful one. So what I'm going to go into is to talk about how this framework works. And the way this works is that there's different systems that build off of each other. And I'll start off in the quadrant number 1 at the top right, going through the exterior individual to explain. The way it works is each quadrant has different levels of systems, but they build on the level below it. So for the exterior individual quadrant, all molecules are made of atoms, and then cells are made of molecules, plants are made of cells, animals get their nourishment from other plants, etc. And the internal individual quadrant is the domain of sciences, and each science corresponds to different levels of systems. So you have physics that deal with atoms, chemistry that deals with molecules, biology that deals with cells, and each quadrant also includes fields that are focused on external measures and take an individualistic perspective, like capitalist economics and most engineering. So what you can see is there's these different levels of systems in the exterior individual quadrant. And one of the things that I want to talk about also is how each quadrant has supernatural components. So biblically, there's a promise that those who go to heaven will eventually have physically resurrected bodies. So that's the supernatural element of this exterior individual quadrant, that eventually will have resurrected bodies. Now going into quadrant 2, or the top left, that's the interior individual perspective, or the mind. There are different levels of systems, and there you start off with inanimate objects which have no interior perspective, and then you start off with basic life, and then you have different levels of consciousness that correspond to different levels of animal and then personal development. Then in this quadrant also includes the fields that are often called the humanities, which are fields that either try to understand or influence the mind. And those are the arts, psychology, Western theology, Western philosophy, and ontology. And here the supernatural element in this quadrant is that biblically, once we get to heaven, we will sin no more, and our spirits will be made perfect in Christ. So we'll have a more Christ-like spirit, and that only happens, through supernatural means. Then in the third quadrant, the exterior collective quadrant, that is the quadrant of culture, and the different levels of systems represent different cultural systems that roughly correspond to different levels from the other quadrants. And you start off with inanimate objects, and there's no culture among inanimate objects, and they survive without any self-direction. And then the next level is animalistic survival, and you could describe that as a type of culture. And then the next level is paganism, which we're using religious terms to describe cultures. There's big overlap, but basically the way I'm defining paganism is that it's basically a more sophisticated form of animalistic survival that incorporates a hedonistic, anarchic form of religion. So there might be some religion involved in it, but it's still fairly animalistic survival-based. Then you get to shamanistic religion, which is one where there is some religious direction. It's not anarchic, but that direction is set by a shaman who is an unchecked religious spiritual leader. And then from there you go to a law-based religion, where there it's just a religion based on rules and includes Judaism, Islam, legalistic Christianity, and fundamentalist Hinduism, Buddhism, and other religions along those lines. And you can see each of these are progressive improvements. And then Christianity, what it did is it broke this law-based religion, and that's a lot of what Jesus describes what he came for in the New Testament. And then you can see for a period in the book of Acts, Christians were truly living as a united body of Christ. But basically, since the time of Constantine, the majority of Christians have been subject to the cultures and norms of their nations, and this includes most Christians today, to where essentially their culture has been captured by their national and regional norms. But eventually, where we want to develop is to have a global living body of Christ, a culture that is a global living body of Christ, similar to the community in Acts. And the different fields in this quadrant are cultural studies, which include fields like anthropology, ethics, justice, Eastern religions, performance arts, which are more focused on influencing the internal experience of groups of people, cosmology, which tries to relate the internal experience of groups with people in a holistic way. And then you have the supernatural element of this, which is a vision of heavenly worship that is often described in the Bible. The best articulation of that is in Revelation 7, where it describes every tribe and nation coming together and worshiping God. And that is ultimately a heavenly culture. And then you have the fourth quadrant, the exterior collective, and there you have different levels of societal development. And you start off with, among just objects, there's no relationships. And then you go to broken relationships that are more animalistic. And then you go to very loose families, and this might include formal families or just any short-term group of people that you care about, that you work for your people, so you're not completely isolated. But what it really this level's talking about is it would be a small antisocial family that's isolationist, short term, and it's kind of a us versus the world type of mentality. Then you move to the next level of societal development, where you have tribes, and this corresponds to the hunter-gatherer stage of societal development. In modern terms, this would more be like gang culture, where gangs have a lot of analogies to tribes, where you have gang warfare and intense loyalty among them. And then you move from that to village society, and this corresponds to societies that have developed horticulture that enable village life. In modern terms, this would be like a city that is dominated by corrupt politics that ruthlessly only favors the end group, or in some countries this might be regional warlords, or dukes before they were kings, and things along those lines. And then you get the early state, and there you have societies where the majority of the economy is still agricultural based, and the characteristic of that is you have unstable governments. And then you move to the nation state, and this corresponds to societies with stable national governments, but they follow a materialist economic model. And here we're describing a materialist economic model as either a consumerist, capitalist-based economic model, socialist-based economic model, or communism. And all of those have the common trait is that they're all materialist-based. And I'll talk about that a little more later. And then the last stage is you have the vision of all Christians globally together loving their neighbors. And really what that would be is it would be a society where the entire body of Christ globally is unified, and all Christians love everyone in the world as their neighbor, as defined in the parable of the Good Samaritan, which basically says that everyone's your neighbor. And this quadrant includes the fields that study how humans are organized, so the social sciences, as well as how physical systems are organized, which would be the holistic sciences. So the social sciences are sociology, law, socialist economics, political science, history. And the holistic sciences are going to be epidemiology, systems engineering, systems theory, ecology, astronomy. So those are the four quadrants. Now, the idea isn't just to introduce that because that's interesting. The idea is to introduce that because it's helpful. Now, if you take those four quadrants, then what you can do is you can kind of get a summary of what's happening in the world in terms of good and evil. And you take the four different quadrants, and this next diagram shows how God is operating. And one of the fundamental principles of systemic theology is that God operates everywhere. God operates at every level of system. So that's the idea that there's this dark shade behind all the systems, that God is operating at every level. At the same time that God's operating is there's also evil in the world, and it operates at different levels of systems. So what God is fundamentally about, from the time of creation, is God is about creating life. And he acts to bring health across all four quadrants. So spiritual growth is basically moving outward in all four quadrants. So in quadrant 1, that includes physical healing, and that could be supernatural or natural physical healing. In quadrant 2, that's salvation, which later becomes sanctification, kind of a Christian buzzword. In quadrant 3, spiritual growth in groups, in terms of culture, is revival. And in quadrant 4, spiritual growth is social movements. At the same time you have these things, you also have evil present. And what that looks like across the different quadrants is you have evil. What evil is really trying to do is it's trying to get each system to degenerate down until all we would become is atoms, which ultimately is bringing death. So there, in quadrant 1, you have sickness and physical oppression. Quadrant 2, you have mental illness, lies, abuse, and addiction. In quadrant 3, you have religious and cultural oppression, and also degeneration, cultural degeneration. And then in quadrant 4, you have political and economic oppression and calamities, and also political and economic degeneration. So as you can see, there's this cosmic battle, and there's God on the forces of good trying to promote life and spiritual growth through these different areas of physical healing, salvation, revival, and social movements. And then there's evil in the world that's trying to bring sickness and illness and abuse, and basically trying to get us to revert back to atoms and ultimately death. So combining all of these in the next slide, you'll see that each circle represents related levels of systems. We live in this global spiritual battle of life and health versus death and sickness. And that's really what is going on in the world. And like any model, what's important to recognize is that this is a rough approximation. It's something that's helpful to understand more complex systems. Not everything's going to fit exactly into the neat little grid here. Some fields might cross different quadrants, but the goal is to show a different pattern and to provide a tool that could be helpful. So understanding kind of the domains of knowledge that's out there, then and also the different perspectives that we can have is helpful just in understanding how we get separated. And one of the strategies that the devil uses is to separate groups and to divide them. So C.S. Lewis's famous picture of hell is that each person is isolated on an island, infinitely separated by every other person. And I think that is a part of Satan's strategy, is to separate us by getting us to get locked into isolated perspectives. The biblical analogy, or the biblical passage for this, is whenever Paul said that we see through a glass darkly, meaning it's like we're seeing the world through a set of sunglasses, really dark sunglasses, and the glass might be different colors for different people. And what that means is that most people may only see one part of one quadrant. Like if you're a biologist, that's how you're used to seeing the world. So what happens is each person's personality and culture predisposes their lens on the world. So using different ways you might characterize people's personality, some of this is using Myers-Briggs personality types, but also using different cultural factors. You have people who are going to be just naturally inclined to be more big picture people, and they're going to be driven to be more collective perspective. Then there's detail-oriented people, and they're going to be a little more predisposed to be individualist perspective. And let me also just add that just because you're predisposed, that doesn't mean that's going to be the perspective you're going to have. People can work beyond their cultures. They can work beyond their own natural tendencies by learning and by educating themselves and by putting themselves in other perspectives. So then you get people who are more the thinkers and very rational. Those people will be more focused on the external. People who are feelers and are more emotional, they're going to be more focused on the internal experience. People who come from Western culture, and especially European Western culture, are going to be more individual and external, whereas there's different groups in Western culture. So a lot of the non-white groups may find themselves more aligned with either Eastern culture or somewhere in the middle. Eastern culture is much more focused on collective and internal. And I would say that's also for a lot of the developing countries in the world are that way. And pretty much most of the non-Western culture parts of the world. Then you have political alignment. Conservatives tend to be aligned and have a perspective more focused on the individual, whereas liberals have a perspective more focused on the collective. And then if someone is coming from a secular perspective, they're going to be focused more on the exterior. Religious perspective is interior. Protestants have a more individual perspective, and Catholics have a more collective perspective. Now, what's important is to just recognize that if you have a lot of things, if you are a thinker and you're detail-oriented and you're in Western culture and you're Protestant and you're religious and you're conservative, just recognize that there's a good chance that there's going to be a strong predisposition that you're going to want to see the world through a individualist and external perspective. Whereas some other people might have different tendencies. And what we want to do is all of us want to try to expand our perspective so we can understand the world more completely. So in addition to understanding the four quadrants, it's also important to understand another dimension to these. So all the fields in each of the four quadrants are only academic knowledge, and that's academic knowledge of the external in those areas. So just as an example, psychology can study, stages of development, but psychology will never tell you what pizza tastes like. The internal experience can tell you what pizza tastes like. Psychology could maybe show you what your brain does, but it couldn't tell you what pizza tastes like. And one of the important principles is that all growth comes from action and experience. So that means there's a big difference between achieving health versus medicine, or having healthy relationships versus psychology, or creating a healthy culture versus anthropology, or creating a just society as compared to political science. So if you really want to address systemic problems, what you need to do is you need to understand the systemic causes in all four quadrants, and then you need to implement an action plan to address the causes in all four quadrants. So that's where systemic theology starts to get to be a helpful tool that's very practical. So in this next slide, we just take a current modern problem that we're dealing with in the world, is the problem of addiction. And we start off just trying to understand and to gain knowledge of addiction. And then what we do is we take each of the quadrants, and what we can do is we try to apply the different levels of the different quadrants to understand some of the multifaceted causes. Because what happens is most problems have multiple interrelated causes. And what happens is that often people try to simplify things into one cause, and then we have big debates over which item is the only cause. And to be honest, most of these debates get summarized as, I believe quadrant 1 is the most important, and really that's because that's their pre-distribution. And then someone else says, I believe quadrant 2 is the most important reason, and that's just based on their own predisposition. They aren't actually looking at all the different causes and the fact that they're all interrelated, and sometimes different areas will be more important than others. So if you look at addiction, there's multiple levels of causes. So starting in the exterior individual quadrant, you can look at the biochemistry of addiction, what's just happening in someone's brain that causes addiction. Then you potentially can understand how you could have medical treatments. You might understand their biology that might lead to a hereditary predisposition. I know that there's been a lot of studies on alcoholics that might be predisposed to alcoholism. That doesn't cause them to have it, just makes them to be maybe more prone to become an alcoholic. Other things, just easy physical access to drugs and addiction. If you have alcohol or drugs in your house every day, that is going to affect you. Then also some other things, if you're not taking physical care of your body, you might try to use drugs to help yourself feel better. And then there might also just be an emotional predisposition that comes from depression or other things. So that's from quadrant one. Then quadrant two would be, what type of internal experience might lead people to using drugs. So there you might have someone, a lot of the people who I know have struggled with drug addiction, even before they get drug addicted, they're unemployed. So they're bored, they're trying to find something to occupy their time, so they try to entertain themselves with drugs. So that can often happen. Often people may not be very emotionally mature or lack emotional intelligence. They might have be isolated or have a lot of broken relationships. They might be spiritually empty. They might have wounds from abuse, and they will be often separated from God. So all those things, that's the internal experience. And then culturally, you could have different cultures that might devalue emotion, the spiritual, and relationships, so that person doesn't actually ever process their emotion. They take it to drugs. Or you might have subcultures where addiction is the norm. I know I once worked at a restaurant that was also a drug house, and everyone there did drugs. So you felt like you're out of place if you weren't doing drugs. So there's subcultures that are like that. Then you have the mass media affecting culture by promoting drugs, alcohol, sex, and food and materialism in the mass media. And then you have different groups of people who might be experiencing different types of oppression. So there's cultural oppression, and some of that could be current, where there's current racism that's happening. Some of it could be a cultural inheritance from past oppression. So if you look at all the different groups of people in the world who've been historically oppressed, almost universally, they also have issues with addiction. Now, sometimes that oppression may have ended several hundred years ago, or 100 years ago, but they're still carrying that within their collective culture. Often the Irish are used as an example of that, where, right now, the level of oppression that happened, in the past for Irish is nothing compared to, what Irish are experiencing right now, to where right now there's much less oppression. But there is still a lot of alcoholism and other things that may have been rooted in the past cultural oppression. So a lot of groups will have to deal with that. And then you just have an overall culture where there might be a worship of sex or hedonism or other gods, and just feeling good, that creates a culture that's going to drive people to addiction. That's the third quadrant. The fourth quadrant is society, and there you have a breakdown of family. You might have a lack of jobs in the economy. You might have political oppression. So that would be structures or systems that cause racism. You might have different political priorities that won't fund drug rehabilitation, but will only fund putting people in prisons that might make it harder for people to get out of drug addiction. You have the economics of drug trade. Often people just say, well, why even try to address it, because economics say that it's going to happen. But that's only one factor of all the different factors. You have global exploitation, where more and more in the globalized world, what's happening is there's failed states like Afghanistan that start to sell heroin because of past wars, past exploitation, and that becomes a way for them to grow their economy. And at the same time you have globalization happening, you also have globalized crime groups. And all these things contribute towards the problem of addiction. But you could understand all these things, and if all you did was understand them, that wouldn't actually be any spiritual growth, that wouldn't be any progress. What you actually have to do is you have to move to the next stage, which is talking about, okay, what is an action plan? How do you solve this? So that is the next slide. And here's just some potential ways you might work at addressing the systemic causes of addiction. And this is where systemic theology really shows how it can be effective. because it gets at addressing all the causes of addiction. So starting in the first quadrant, in the top right, there's a lot of people who may be depressed, and they might be biologically depressed from a biological cause, and they might just need to get psychotropic medication rather than using drugs or some other addiction to self-medicate. Another thing you can do in that is just remove access to the addictive item. So if you're alcoholic, don't go in bars. If you're a drug addict, stay away from people who are using drugs. If you have another addiction, avoid that. 12-step groups often use an acronym called HALT, which is taking physical care of your body, and also some of it's physical and emotional care. But there, what you try to do is, if you're hungry, you try to address your physical hunger. If you're tired, you try to, address your tiredness. If you're angry or lonely, then you deal with those emotions. So that's one way of dealing with addiction. The other way is on the interior individual. There's a lot of things you can do. So, this goes into the different levels of, personal growth, just trying to get healthy friendships, possibly going to counseling to deal with past abuse, to establish physical and emotional safety. That might also include getting a job, to pursue spiritual fulfillment. And fundamentally, it's about getting connected to God and getting connected in community. And then the exterior collective, if you have a whole society, a whole culture that's dealing with drug addiction, what you really need is a spiritual revival. Or if, short of that, what you could do as an individual is you can pursue or create subcultures that value things that might help avoid addiction. So like processing emotion, dealing with relationships, dealing with the spiritual, avoiding subcultures where addiction is the norm, avoiding triggering mass media. So if you're someone who's a sex addict or a porn addict, you might not want to watch the Victoria's Secret commercials or things along those lines. Pursuing groups that help to cope with cultural oppression. So for a lot of people who are experiencing oppression, you can't change the system by yourself. You can, work towards that, but that's going to take a long time. You also have to be able to cope in a healthy way, and a lot of times that'll happen with, Black history and developing, positive culture for different minority groups, and pursuing groups that positively address cultural inheritance from past oppression. So, a lot of groups will only want to, embrace all aspects of their cultural background, but biblically, we're supposed to embrace the godly aspects, but the non-godly aspects, like if you come from a culture where alcoholism is a big aspect of that culture, that's something that it's going to be helpful to work with groups that will deal with that. And ultimately, what we want to do is immerse ourselves in a culture that worships God. Then the exterior collective is the things that you can do there in society is you can restore and build up the family. And then you can support groups that are addressing addiction, oppression, promoting policies that are addressing addiction, and addressing global systemic causes of drug trade. So those are all the things that you can do to address addiction. So hopefully that's helpful in just explaining, how systemic theology might be helpful. So the next slide, what it talks about is the stages of spiritual growth, and it integrates different things. In psychology, there's something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and basically it's a set of developmental stages. And then biblically, this also integrates the fivefold ministry. So what these stages of spiritual growth is these are actually the different levels of the quadrant 2, the interior individual quadrant. That's the top left. And what this chart is doing is it's integrating all these different things, psychology and Maslow's hierarchy of needs and Christian elements of the fivefold ministry. So basically the idea behind this is that there's different needs that often come before others. And what I've done in this diagram is if you look at the first level of each part of the pyramid, it talks about the need, and the second level is what is the spiritual ministry that's addressing that need. So you start off with the physiological needs. So, and to understand how this works is physiological needs, if you're dying of thirst, you're not sitting around worried about your emotional needs for that weekend of, what you're going to do next Friday. So often physiological needs, if they're really acute or strong, often it's going to be, they might take precedence over other needs. Now, this is an overall principle. It's a rough approximation. It doesn't have to be sequential, and in fact, most people are developing at multiple levels at the same time. I also just want to put a qualifier saying that God breaks down some of this hierarchy so that people may suspend their physical needs to love someone. People might fast. That's, suspending your need for food for spiritual growth. But it is helpful to recognize that there is kind of this hierarchy of needs that tends to apply. So there's physiological needs, and the ministry that needs those is outreach ministries or disaster relief, where you might be providing food, water, or helping in some sort of natural disaster. Then the next level of need is safety, and there, it's you're talking about someone who might be homeless, or they might be concerned about getting shot. And if you're homeless or concerned about being shot, you're not that worried about your social life next Friday. And that's met by outreach ministries that could provide shelter for the homeless, or after-school programs for youth in unsafe neighborhoods and things along those lines. And roughly, these need states also correspond to personal development and internal states for people. Then the next level is, and this just goes biblically, where James said, if someone is, needing food, don't just say, I'm going to pray for them and meet your spiritual needs, and then let them still starve. That's biblical, that you have to meet the physical needs. Now, once you've done that, then you can move to emotional needs and emotional healing, and that is where salvation happens. So that's just biblical, Romans 10:10, for it's with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it's with your mouth that you confess and are saved. So salvation's a heart-level decision. It doesn't end there. There's the continuation of sanctification and other steps. But at that level, the two, so this gets into the fivefold ministry, and let me first just summarize. The fivefold ministry comes from the New Testament, where there are several places where it talks about the different primary gifts that people might have. Ephesians 4:11 through 13 talks about 5: pastors, evangelists, teachers, prophets, and apostles. So what this chart is doing is it is connecting the fivefold ministry to the different needs that people have. So, and it's also important to recognize that just because one area of ministry may be above another one in this pyramid, it doesn't make it any more important. It just goes to show how it relates to the hierarchy of needs based on the individual. So pastors, what they're good at is helping to meet the emotional needs of individuals. Evangelists are good at bringing salvation to groups of people. So they're more like the pastor, except meeting the emotional needs and the spiritual needs of people collectively. So then the next level, once you get your emotional needs taken care of and you're safe, then you move to the next level of development, which is often called esteem or rational development, and often this is where people end up going off to college. Unfortunately, in our society, most people don't get their emotional stability before they go off to college, and that's why you end up having a lot of people drinking and other things along those lines. But at that level, the spiritual gift is teachers, and there what you're talking about spiritually is you're talking about discipleship. So then the next level is ultimately living your calling. So each person has a unique calling. Some people will be called to be, teachers, pastors, evangelists, but other people may have, unique callings, outside of those. And ultimately, you want to be using your unique calling to serve others in ministry, however you've been called. Then, beyond that, you have apostles, the apostolic and the prophetic. So that's the last two of the fivefold ministry. And what the apostolic and prophetic is involved with is they're involved with movements. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And ultimately, what we're wanting to do is to get to be like Christ. And ultimately, we're only going to be perfect once we get to heaven. But that's something that we strive for, and that's the path of development. Now, there's a couple things that's important to note on this. Also, is that often in Western society, there is a major focus on the top part of this pyramid, and that's because we've already taken care of the bottom part in our own needs. But often what groups will say is, meeting emotional needs or discipleship, that's spiritual, but doing outreach ministries or helping, someone who's homeless, that's, not spiritual. There's no biblical basis for that. In fact, the Bible says otherwise. Where that comes from is actually a class bias, in that lower class needs are often more focused on the bottom of this pyramid, on the safety and physiological needs. And what happens is often middle class churches and ministries aren't very well equipped to meet those needs. So what's important is that, regardless of whatever, class background you come from, you recognize that all of these needs are important, and you don't just come at it with a bias. So that's the top left quadrant. The next thing I want to talk about is, and I want to expand a little bit more on the role of the apostles and prophets. And I want to talk about a term from systems theory called the butterfly effect. Most people have heard of this, and there was a scientist, Edward Lorenz, that he studied atmospheric models, and where this comes from is he changed a tiny parameter in one of his computer models that was the equivalent of a butterfly flapping its wings. And what he saw was that the model predicted that butterfly flapping its wings could change the weather across the world. So he gave a talk that said, does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? And that's where this term, the butterfly effect, and the idea is that we live in incredibly complex systems, and we often don't know how different elements of systems might be affected. What's important in that is to recognize that in the spiritual battle, God understands all the complexity of systems. So one way you could think about what God can do and how God can work amazingly, and I would say miraculously, without defined physical laws, is that God knows which butterfly to touch to avoid the tornado. So essentially, what you could think of apostles and prophets, what they do is they're associated with movements, and those movements are going to impact culture or society, and that's the third, basically the bottom quadrants. And what happens with apostles is apostles and prophets, they listen to God, and God essentially tells them what butterfly to touch to create this movement. So the way it works is prophets identify the movement and apostles lead it. So if you look throughout the Bible, prophets are always predicting movements. Most prophets never saw the movements. There are some that were more the apostolic level, and they actually led the movement, and that's in the New Testament. And then in the Old Testament, you had some combined prophets that had similarities to apostles, like Moses, where they're acting prophetically, but also leading a movement. Some spiritual examples in the social arena. You look at Rosa Parks, who she just decided to sit up on a bus, and someone asked, why did you sit up on a bus that day, or sit down on a bus in the white section of the bus? And she said, because I was tired. She had walked all day. She didn't know that in doing that, it was going to set off a national civil rights movement that was going to be led by Martin Luther King Jr. And it was also ultimately going to bring civil rights to African Americans and a lot of other people in American society. There's been other examples of that. William Wilberforce ending slavery, William Booth with the serving with the Salvation Army and serving the poor in cities. And then another example of this is Gandhi's March to the Sea, where Gandhi, all he did was he said he was going to walk across India to the sea, and he knew that if he did that, it was going to break the back of the British government. And he broke the back of the British government because what happened is millions of people followed him there, and then the government realized how much of a following he had, and at that point the British government decided to turn over rule of India to the Indians. And all he did was march to the sea. So that's the example of how apostles and prophets know what butterfly to touch, so to speak. The same type of thing happens with revivals, where you get revivalists where they're just caught up in a larger movement of what God's doing. They'll all say that's what they're doing, and God's just appointed them to be at the front of it. So the reason why that's important is this concept of the butterfly effect is something that's very common in systems theory, but it also happens in the spiritual department. It's helpful to understand what role apostles and prophets play. The next thing I want to talk about is how spirituality and materialism falls into this. So what materialism is, it's a lens or a worldview or a religion, and sociologists just describe religion as a worldview. So everyone has a religion. There's no person who doesn't have a worldview. Everyone has a worldview. But what materialism is, it's a worldview or lens that focuses only on the external and reductionist answers. And what reductionist answers are is they basically say, whenever you have two possible answers, choose the most simple. So that's a group of assumptions that materialism has. So what the assumptions do is they form a lens and they distort reality in a way that leads to spiritual regression. So this is why materialism is often contrasted with spirituality. And how it leads to spiritual regression is that the external lens, first of all, the external lens only shows external quadrants by definition, but the reductionist lens gives preference to the center, explanations that are at the center by definition. So what that does is it creates a hostility between religion and science. So there's a lot of different sub-branches of materialism. One sub-branch is the scientific method, and the scientific method only values what can be measured and reproduced. Then you have capitalism and communism, and as much as capitalism and communism would like to say that they're different, they're actually more alike than they are different in that they both try to measure societal progress only by what can be measured. So if you have more things, then you're better off. So they're both materialist based. There's a philosophy called objectivism that was started by Ayn Rand, and basically that philosophy is that only objective truth is important. Evolution is another form of materialism that assumes that humans are the same as animals, which is a worldview that's based on an assumption that leads to a spiritual regression. And then humanism basically is the idea is that humans can determine all truth and good using only rational thought without God. So that's important to understand what materialism does in terms of this grid. Materialism focuses on the right side of this grid. It misses the left side. It also drives things towards the center. Now, why that's important is to recognize the limits of science. So I got my graduate degree at MIT, which is one of the leading scientific schools in the world, and I did a program studying some of the limits of science and systems theory. And one of the things that people realize with the limits of science is, first of all, if you recognize, what science is that each level of science has its own set of laws and models, and generally those laws and models only function with the most simplest cases. So if you take the atomic model as an example, the atomic model, after you get to, that works great for really small atoms, but after you get to large atoms, the atomic model actually doesn't accurately predict what happens with atoms. And that's the way most systems are. So most systems are too complex to be solvable. If you look at the field of math, and you take the ratio of solvable problems, the ratio of unsolvable problems, and this involves doing a bit of calculus and things that are complicated, but basically if you take what we can solve in math and what we can't solve in math and you divide one by the other, we can solve 0% of the problems out there. 0%. It's 0.00000%. Physics has the same type of limitation. There's something called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and what it does is it says that it provides a fundamental limit that really can't be broken on how much you can know about physics. And that limit actually cascades into other fields. It cascades into chemistry and other fields, because if you can't predict what's happening with atoms, then you can't always predict what's going to happen with molecules, and that leads to a new field called chaos theory, basically which that each of these limits within systems create fundamental limits to knowledge in other fields. And just taking the quote from Einstein, a lot of people would say he was the smartest person of the 20th century, and he said, "We still do not know 1,000th of 1% of what nature has revealed to us." What I believe, chaos theory is getting much closer to showing not only do we not know that much, but I think it will prove that we can never know that much. So not only do we not know that, but there's most of the world we will never be able to understand, because it can be proven that it's so complicated that it can't be solved. This is a little secret of science that they might talk about at MIT, but they don't like to let the rest of the world know the limits of science. So that gets into the next question. Why is the world powerless against modern problems? And the reason is because we've taken a very limited worldview. We've focused only on the individual and the external perspectives, and our internal and collective perspectives are underdeveloped. So we lack the tools needed to address the world's most important problems. So you look at addiction, you look at cultural degradation, you look at racism, climate change, terrorism. All those are complex systems. And what's really needed is a systemic view that understands the complexities of multiple causes, and can provide solutions to that. But the problem is that the current worldview in science is a bias towards academic understanding rather than action and experience and understanding the systemic causes. So what we really should be trying to do is, biblically, the Bible talks about in John 4 that a time is coming and has now come when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers that the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. Basically, what this is talking about is you have the spirit, which is the left side of this diagram, and then you have truth, which is the right side. So knowledge of the internal, knowledge of the external, so academic knowledge. And we need both, and that's biblical. Biblically, we need knowledge of the external. We need to understand truth, and that primarily is going to come from teaching and learning, and that's going to come from the scientific method. But then there's the growth of the internal, spiritual or spirit development. And that's going to come through both individual and collective experience. So you can study as much as you want about internal growth, but you only are going to grow from experience. So that's the difference between having emotionally healthy relationships and having a PhD in psychology. Having a PhD in psychology doesn't lead to any spiritual growth unless you have healthy relationships. So the scientific method, by definition, it doesn't apply to the internal side of things, because that's something that can't be measured. Science can never tell you what pizza tastes like. It can only tell you, here's the chemical reactions that are happening in your tongue, but it doesn't know what that experience. So what's really needed is there needs to be something to replace or supplement the scientific method. And so if you look at what the scientific method does, is it basically focuses only on the external, what can be measured and replicated. Now, what I'm proposing is something that includes the scientific method, but it's larger than that. It focuses on all four quadrants, so the systemic method. And there, the approach for finding truth is that you're going to use the scientific method for looking at the external, but then you're going to use a different method for the internal, and it's biblically, how was truth and how was truth and growth resolved in the New Testament. You look at how they dealt with that, with the apostles coming together and dealing with various issues in a complex relational form that is involving the fivefold ministry, with apostles and prophets kind of being at the center of that. And that is really how you're going to look at the internal. Now, the secular world actually has examples of people like this. Like if you look at the venture capital community that invests in startup companies, they aren't just using the scientific method. They're using a lot of intuition, and what they're doing is they're using people who have expertise in identifying what's going to be successful. That's essentially what you're talking about with, what apostles and prophets can do. Now, one big difference between the systemic method and the scientific method is scientific method is reductionist, so it focuses on the most simple solution, and it's trying to only find, generally one cause to things, whereas the systemic method is taking a holistic approach to things. If you look at the primary questions that each method uses, the scientific method's only concerned about what is true. Scientific method doesn't care about what is helpful. And I use the term helpful rather than what is good, because good, can bring up a lot of controversy, but really you're talking about the same thing. So, the systemic method asks the question of what is true, but it basically works in a left hand and right hand method of what is helpful combined with that. And there, the goal of the systemic method is to grow in truth and to increase health or increase life in the world. So increase the health of systems. Whereas the scientific method is just focused on expanding proven knowledge. So you have all these PhD theses that get put in the archives of some library somewhere, with the scientific method marching on, but there isn't nearly as much growth in improving society. So that's some of the limits of the scientific method. The next part of what I want to talk about is systems and the demonic. Now, a lot of times whenever people hear the term demonic, they automatically think of things from movies and people levitating and the movie The Exorcist. Let me start off and just use an example to take away some people's fear. In talking about the term the demonic, we use the term the demonic to describe what's happening in the world. So you take a physical example, so the atomic model. So no one has ever seen the atomic model. It's something that people don't actually see, but it's useful because it accurately describes what we can observe. And then you ask the question, are atoms real? Well, yes, atoms are real. We're all standing on them. We're all surrounded by them at all times. The same type of thing is true with demons. So, demons, you could translate that. Demons, use whatever word you want to use, but in the individual translation, going back to the four quadrants, what you could think of the demonic as being addiction and abuse. A lot of people will have used the terms the demon of alcoholism or drug addiction or sexual abuse. Then there's the collective translation of that, of people use the terms the demon of slavery or apartheid or segregation or racism. And why this is helpful is just like the atomic model. There's principles in understanding atoms that are helpful to understand that apply towards demons, and the Bible is full of describing how do you deal with spiritual battles, how do you deal with evil and things along those lines. So if you understand these different things, like slavery, like apartheid, like drug addiction, then you understand the spiritual principles. Then you can understand how do you fight these using the spiritual principles that come from the Bible and come from Christianity. So one of the principles is that demons give power in the short term, but in the long term, they make you pay. So essentially, demons generally are a shortcut. And basically, anything you worship other than God can become demonic. And so, going through some of these questions, just like the atomic model, it's not just a model, atoms are real. I believe demons are real. Theologically, a lot of Christians, have a hard time talking about demons because, biblically the Bible makes it fairly clear that Christians, can't be possessed by demons, and that's something I believe, that Christians can't be possessed where they would be completely controlled by demons. Now, can Christians be oppressed by demons? Well, if you look at how we're describing demons, could a Christian become an alcoholic? I think they probably could. Could that have demonic elements to it? I think it probably could. So I think that Christians can be oppressed by demons, not necessarily possessed by demons, but demons are real. So looking at what are the strongholds or fundamental strongholds or demons that affect us today, that's what this next slide's about. And let me just talk about how these forces work. So as I mentioned, evil essentially is trying to get us to regress from humans to being more animalistic, and you can see how addictions do that, to being ultimately dying and just becoming like atoms and chemicals. So in each quadrant, there's one overarching system that I would say is affecting our current times. Now there could be more, but just to, for the sake of talking about what are the major systems. So in quadrant 1, dealing with the body, I would say the fundamental thing that society is wrestling with right now is dealing with systemic health effects. And there, just to provide an example, you look at all the leading causes of death in developed countries. They all are primarily caused by systemic causes. So the top 4 are heart disease, cancer, stroke, and lung disease. All of those are caused by systemic causes. These systemic causes are really hard to prove using science. Just a case in point is companies still try to debate whether smoking causes cancer. Everyone knows smoking causes cancer. You have to be stupid to realize smoking doesn't cause cancer, but companies still try to debate it. So it's a failure of science that they haven't been able to fully close that debate. And I think that there's a lot of areas where the systemic causes, especially on their effect on physical body, that are like that. So you look at, what are the causes of heart disease, cancer, stroke, lung disease? Often it has to do with diet and, the obesity epidemic. There's a lot of, parts of the world where pollution's the major contributor to cancer. You can have addictions that might cause, lung disease from smoking and things along those lines. So you have these complex things that are causing these systemic causes that are affecting health. And I would call that kind of a demonic force. The next area, and I've already covered addiction in previous slides, so I'm going to go to the third quadrant, which is what I describe the major force there is cultural exploitation in media. And the reason why I talk about this is because this is something that's overarching, affecting our culture globally across the world. And essentially, here's how this system works. Is, you have what I describe as the modern form of worship. And what that is corporations use images of sex gods, or images of youth or alcohol, drugs, materialism, violence, and essentially those gods will bless them with increased profits. So, back in the day, whenever there were primitive cultures, you would have your little god of fertility, or your god of sex, or your god of victory, or whatever you would have in a closet, and you would pray to that god, and the idea was it would bless you. That's essentially what corporations are doing. So, except instead of putting an image in a closet, you have a billboard with half-naked woman on the highway. But it's not that different from whenever you look at the statues that they had in Rome of the different gods and goddesses that they worship. And then what happens is we all participate in this culture, this group worship, by consuming media, which numbs us, it keeps us occupied, it creates a steady diet of sex, youth, alcohol, drugs, violence, and materialistic consumption. So essentially, as we talked about the way demons work, is they're going to give you some short-term good. So they give short-term good for the corporations by providing them with increased profit. Whenever I sit and watch some movie or television that's honestly just nasty, that is half the stuff that's on there these days, that is gonna maybe have some short-term good of entertaining me. But what happens is in the third step, those images affect us by putting too much of our focus on those things. So we ultimately end up worshiping those things. If you had a statue of some female goddess, and you stared at it 30 hours a week, you would describe that as worshiping it. It's not that different with television. So then what happens is we become in bondage through addiction, debt, work commitments, as we buy a lot of things, and watching television that's telling us to buy things, to eat, to do all these things, then we have to end up working more, and we essentially become in bondage to these things. So you get the short-term gain of being entertained, but then in the long term, you're losing. And then the final consequence is that as a part of this, in addition to this cultural exploitation affecting us, it's also affecting the cultures that are often involved in that. So the objectifying women, exploiting hip-hop culture, exploiting developing countries. And part of the reason why I use this as an example is a lot of people in the Western world don't understand how critical this is to the rest of the world. They don't understand that the cultural exploitation that the West is responsible for and the rest of the world often is one of the major issues that's causing war. So you look at the war in the Middle East, and you look at what are the leaders of the Middle East saying about why why are they resistant to the United States and things along those lines. The number one factor from what I read isn't oil. I think that's the number two factor. The number one factor is avoiding the cultural exploitation that would come from the decadence of Western culture. And the same is true in many developing countries like China. And what ends up happening is China just tried to keep pornography out of its country, but then you had intense pressure that's put on by these global organizations like the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and what they do is they force these countries to open up their cultural barriers that basically enable companies to culturally exploit their societies. So we need to recognize that. So this is not only affecting ourselves, but it's affecting the rest of the world. You could describe it as cultural pollution, where we're polluting our culture with nastiness. There's been the same type of exploitation that's happened in other areas. Many of my friends who are immersed in the hip-hop community, they believe that hip-hop culture has been hijacked rather than representing what black and urban leaders might want to present as the culture. What's shown is essentially what white kids in the suburbs want to see, and because they're often the ones that are buying the hip-hop CDs. So essentially, you've had hip hop culture being hijacked by corporations and white kids in the suburbs. So that is in the third quadrant in the cultural domain, one of the primary overarching strongholds or demonic forces. Then what you have is you have collective systemic oppression, and or you could describe that as exploitive politics and globalization. And there, essentially, the way that system works is our system works to reward politicians and companies that get things for you. So these politicians and companies are aggressively getting things for you. It's like hiring a really strong man to go and, grab things from other people, essentially. And what happens is they end up exploiting people who have less power in different parts of the world, and you benefit through reduced prices and increased resources and benefits. But what happens is we're actually contributing by supporting those politicians and companies. We're contributing to systemic injustice. So there you end up having unjust wars. You end up having economic exploitation. You end up having de facto segregation. We're now more segregated than we were during before the Civil Rights Movement. And that has to do with a lot of policies that politicians set up and companies. You have a lot of racism, sexism, and in the past, things like slavery, and still currently you have people trafficking. So there's still this systemic oppression that happens. So one of the last things I want to talk about is just an understanding of God from a systems perspective. And I want to present this because it helps to bridge the divide between science and faith. And so if you just imagine a world where the entire universe, all systems exist in God's brain or consciousness. Now God is beyond that. This could be a very small part of God, where the entire universe and all these systems are in God's brain or consciousness. So God isn't the equivalent of those things, but all those things could exist in God's brain. So this is just one way of you could think about God. So for those of you who've seen the movie The Matrix, where basically the idea is the entire world as we know it was operating inside of a computer, if people can imagine a world like that, then God could, God obviously is bigger than a computer, so he could have, the entire universe, including time and space. So God exists outside of time, he exists outside of space. All space and time exist by God because they're created by his consciousness. So essentially what that means is natural laws function like a computer program governing things, but like a computer program, God can modify the laws, can modify the program at any time. But it's important to understand the laws in knowledge of God, because that's the study of spiritual laws and knowledge. And what's happened is science and religion broke because science was concerned that if religion wouldn't, if it came up with too simple of answers, then people wouldn't continue to learn. If you just said that, well, all sickness is caused by demons, which was thought at one point, then people wouldn't have learned about medicine. And that actually has made a huge difference in saving a lot of lives, and that's spiritual progress to learn those things. And we need to continue to learn the study of all knowledge. That's spiritual growth. This also helps to reconcile evolution because there's, if you think about a world where God has the entire universe in his brain, God can do whatever he wants in that world, and basically it God could have provided things that made it look like there was evolution. He could have done a lot of things that I think could resolve evolution. So that's just one example of how that could be useful. So I want to just conclude by talking about a vision for systemic theology. And what systemic theology is about is a new form of theology to address today's issues. It covers all knowledge and experience that promotes spiritual growth. And its goal is to promote spiritual growth. So all truth is God's truth. It includes all fields. Internal knowledge must be experienced. And the central questions it's asking is, how do we create systems that promote spiritual growth? And I believe what's going to happen, so systemic theology, so this talk is described as an introduction to systemic theology. And what really needs to happen is there needs to be every one of those fields that's listed, and even more fields than that. There need to be people that would contribute towards the systemic theology. So, what would a more complete systemic theology look like? I think that the internet and the web provide some good models of what that might look like. I think it would be a Wikipedia. A complete systemic theology would be like a Wikipedia with every possible topic that might be used to promote spiritual growth. That would be a very large encyclopedia. It would probably be the size of the Wikipedia or larger. And to pull that together, it's not just about knowledge, because Wikipedia itself is about knowledge. What would be different about systemic theology, it would be about topics on how to promote spiritual growth. So how do you help addicts? That's going to be a topic in there, not just knowledge about addiction. So that's one aspect of a complete systemic theology. I think the other part of the vision for a complete systemic theology is, imagine that the entire body of Christ is connected, using maybe a web or internet-based social network where every Christian is connected with the areas of greatest need in the world that matches their gifts. So if someone in Africa needs, a given some legal help, then you could help them out. And every person, across the world would be interconnected. That, I think, would be the experience side of systemic theology. So not just the knowledge, but also adding the experience. And that's what we're really trying to do at Tech Mission. So at Tech Mission, we have the largest, to my knowledge, the largest collection of open Creative Commons content in a wiki format for Christians. We have over 50,000 articles, and they're articles about how do you help addicts, how do you help at-risk youth, how do you help these things. And it's a wiki of knowledge promoting individual and social spiritual growth. And then we also have a website called christianvolunteering.org, and that's a website of thousands of experiences where you can actually act to promote spiritual growth and so on. So we've partnered with almost 10,000 ministries that have listed thousands of different ways that you can actually get involved. That's the vision for systemic theology. I think we are at less than 1,000th of 1% of imagining how big that could be if God continues to grow that, continues to combine the knowledge of the Christian community, continues to combine the opportunities for Christians to act and to connect the body of Christ. So that ultimately is what systemic theology is about. It's about equipping the entire body of Christ, and it's about the entire body of Christ serving everyone in the world. That's what systemic theology is about. So I'd like to just finish with a few references and credits. As I mentioned, the four-quadrant framework came from a brief history of everything with Ken Wilber. The idea for the term systemic theology came from a conversation that I had with Doug Hall, the founder of Emmanuel Gospel Center, and Tech Mission staff provided a lot of feedback on these ideas. So we're going to post this presentation at urbanministry.org. If you'd like to have comments, I would absolutely encourage you to add to that. We want you to add to this systemic theology through our wiki and through other areas. So thanks a lot.